From Logic to Anthropology, Affirmative Dialectics. The fundamental problem in the philosophical field today is to find something like a new logic. We cannot start out from considerations on politics, life, creation, or action. We must first describe a new logic, or, more precisely, a new dialectics. This was that way that Plato took. And it was, after all, the one Marx proposed too. Marx's work is not to begin with a new historical vision, a new theory of class struggle, and so on, but instead a new general logic that he developed in the wake of Hegelian dialectics. Marx was perhaps the first, after Plato, to forge an explicit relation between revolutionary politics and a new dialectical framework. Our problem today is the same. To be sure, after 2 centuries of successes and failures in revolutionary politics, and in particular after the failure of the state form of socialism, we must have something to rectify. But what we also have to find is a new logic, a new philosophical proposition adequate for all forms of creative novelty. Thus, the difficult question of dialectical and of non-dialectical relations is a pressing one. Our problem, if you will, is the problem of negativity. When the logical framework of political action is of the classical dialectical type, what is fundamental is negation. The development of the political struggle is fundamentally something like a revolt against, an opposition to, or a negation of. And the newness, the creation of the new state or of the new law, is always a result of the process of negation. This is the Hegelian framework. You have a relation between affirmation and negation, construction and negation, in which the real principle of movement and the real principle of creation is negation. And so the very definition of the revolutionary class is to be against the present state or against the present law, in the precise sense that revolutionary consciousness, as Lenin would say, is basically the consciousness that one stands in a relation of negation to the existing order. But this vision as such cannot be sustained today. We are living through a sort of crisis of trust in the power of negativity, and we have known 2 forms of this crisis. Adorno thinks that the classical Hegelian dialectics was way too affirmative, far too subordinated to the potency of the totality and of the one. He proposes a sort of hypernegativity, the name of which is negative dialectics. Today we know that by proceeding in this way, all we ultimately end up with is an ethics of compassion, a vision where the hero of our consciousness is the suffering human body, the pure victim. And we know as well that this moralism is perfectly adequate to capitalist domination pursued under the mask of democracy. Negri and Althusser, on the other hand, argue that Hegelian dialectics was overly negative, way too subjective and all too indifferent to the absolute potency of nature, life, or the movement of history. They find in Spinoza a model of philosophy that is ultimately devoid of negation. Today we know that by proceeding in this way, we are left with an acceptance of the dominant order, in accordance with the conviction that this order is full of newness and creativity, and that in the end, modern capitalism is the immediate strength working, beyond empire, towards a sort of communism. What all my work has sought to do is to propose a new dialectical framework, neither via return to the young Marx or to Hegel, nor via the negative dialectics of Adorno, which is like an aesthetics of human rights, nor via the affirmative construction proposed by Negri, which destroys all forms of dialecticism and amounts to a sort of Nietzschean gay science of history. I think the problem today is to find a way to reverse classical dialectical logic inside of itself, so that affirmation, or the positive proposition, comes before negation, instead of after it. Differently put, in some sense my attempt is to find a dialectical framework where something of the future comes before the negative present. I'm not advocating a suppression of the relation between affirmation and negation. Revolt and class struggle certainly remain essential, nor a pacifist orientation or the like. The question is not whether we need to struggle or to oppose. More precisely, it concerns the relation between negation and affirmation. So when I say that there is something non-dialectical, whether with regard to Paul or to the field of concrete political analysis, I am putting forward the same idea formally speaking. We have to try to understand the exact conditions under which we are able to have something like a possibility of concrete negation. And this can only be achieved, it seems to me, in the field of primitive affirmation, through something that is primitively affirmative and not negative. To use my own terminology, it is a question of event and subject. Ultimately, what I am saying is very simple. First, that to open up a new situation, a new possibility, it is essential that there be a new creativity of time and a new creativity of the situation. There has to be something that is an actual opening, which is what I name event. What is an event? An event is simply that which interrupts the law, the rules and the structure of the situation, and thus creates a new possibility. So an event is not in the first place the creation of a new situation. Rather, it is the creation of a new possibility, which is not the same thing. In fact, the event takes place in a situation that remains the same, but this same situation is inside the new possibility. For Paul, for example, the event is the resurrection of Christ, and this event does not directly change anything in the Roman Empire. So the general situation, which is the Roman Empire, remains the same. But inside the situation, an event transpires, thus opening a new possibility. Things are the same in the political field. In May 1968 in Paris, for instance, no real change occurred in the general situation of the state. De Gaulle remained in power, and the government continued to operate with its police and so on. But there was the opening of a new possibility, and this is what I mean by event. After that comes the possibility of realizing, materializing, the consequences of this new possibility, the elaboration of which amounts to the creation of a new subjective body. A new subjective body is the realization of the possibility opened by the event in concrete form, and is thus the development of some consequences of the new possibility. Among these consequences, different forms of negation are, of course, to be found: struggle, revolt, new possibilities of being against something, the destruction of some part of the law, and so on. But these forms of negation are consequences of the birth of the new subjectivity, not the other way around. The new subjectivity is not a consequence of the negation. So, this logic is actually non-dialectical, in Hegel's and Marx's sense, since it does not start with the creativity of negation as such, though the site of negativity is certainly included in the consequences of something which is affirmative. With this, I can return to a book I wrote many years ago about the Apostle Paul. This book was written in order to put forward a clear example of this new logic, that is, of a new logic for all truth procedures, those in the political field included. Paul offers a very clear example of how to think through the relation between an event and a new subjectivity. This was my main point. Paul provides a new, very acute perspective on how this logic operates in the field of law, and specifically in the new subject's relation to the old law. Indeed, Paul explains very clearly that whenever an event occurs that is truly the creation of a new possibility in the situation, a new body must first be created and a new subjectivity affirmed prior to all negation or negative consequences. The first thing to do is to create, to affirm the new subjectivity. What then stands at the very beginning of the new subjectivity and the new subjective body? It is the group of people that affirms that there really is a new possibility. They affirm the affirmation. In the case of Christianity, they affirm the resurrection. After such an affirmation, a lot of practical and symbolic consequences will follow for the situation in question. It is interesting to see in the example of Paul, however, that the very beginning of something new is always something like a pure affirmation of the new possibility as such. There is a resurrection, and you have to affirm it. And when you affirm the resurrection and organize that sort of affirmation, because affirmation occurs with others and is directed towards others, you create something absolutely new, not in the form of a negation of what exists, but in the form of the newness inside of what exists. And so we no longer have negation on the one hand and affirmation on the other. Instead, there is affirmation and division, or the creation that grounds the independence of new subject from within the situation of the old. This is the general orientation of the new logic. Within this orientation, it becomes possible to propose a novel examination of all the old words in such and such a field of knowledge or action. As an exercise, I propose that we discuss the word democracy. The word democracy is indeed the common term of all ideological dispositions of the imperialist states today. In fact, of pretty much all the reactionary states. So we must declare a first rupture by saying that we do not accept their ideological line, since it ultimately amounts to the idea that their democracy cannot be resisted except if one is a terrorist, an ally in despotism, and so on. This means, however, that we are in a situation where we have to clarify for ourselves not only the content of the concept, but also whether we want to use the word. Is there a possible good use of the word democracy today? That is my subjective question. It is not exactly a theoretical one. Why? Because I can always name democracy something else. There can be both good and bad uses of the word democracy today, and there is probably something genuinely confusing about the use of the word itself, insofar as one generally understands it immediately in terms of its present meaning, which is basically that given it by all the reactionary forces in the world today. I have ultimately decided to keep the word. It is generally a good thing to keep a word, for the reason that there is something problematic about leftists saying, for example, I am not interested in democracy at all because it has become practically meaningless. On the other hand, it is true that when you talk about democracy, you continue to operate on the terrain of the common ideology. The situation is difficult because we have to criticize the actual democracies in one sense, and in a different sense, we have to criticize the political propaganda made of the term democracy today. If we do not do this, we will become paralyzed. In the first case, we would be saying, yes, we are in a democracy, but democracy can do something else. However, this would ultimately put us in a defensive position, which is the opposite of my conception, since my position involves starting with an affirmation, not at all with a defensive posture. So, if we stick to the word, we must divide the signification of the word classically and differentiate between good democracy and bad democracy, between the reactionary conception of democracy and the progressive conception of democracy. But what is the basis of that division? In classical Marxism, there is a clear basis upon which to divide everything, namely according to class distinction. We can distinguish popular democracy from bourgeois democracy, or perhaps to be more contemporary, from yuppie democracy. And the possibility of that sort of division is also the possibility of thinking democracy as something other than a form of state. It is a distinction not only between popular democracy and yuppie democracy, but between true democracy and democracy as a form of state, as a form of oppressive state, as a class state. But this strict duality is not convincing in the framework of a new dialectical thinking. It is too easy to determine popular democracy negatively as being all that the state democracy is not. To escape the game of negation, and the negation of negation, I shall now present three understandings of democracy, not a division into two, but into three. That is always my trick. When I run into a difficulty with a division in two, I create a division in three. And this is why, in general fashion, as Giorgio Agamben was the first to remark, I ultimately have, for every problem, 4 terms. Hegel has 3 terms, because after the negation and the negation of the negation, there is the totality of the process, the becoming of the absolute knowledge as a 3rd term. But for me, after 2 different affirmations, the conservative one and the affirmation of a new possibility, there are 2 different negations. This is because the conservative negation of novelty by the reaction is not the same as the negative part, directed against the conservative position of the new affirmation. On the question of democracy, I give the 3 primitive terms. First, there is democracy as a form of state, which is actually democracy in its commonplace meaning, that is, representative democracy or parliamentarian ideology. Secondly, there is democracy understood as movement, or a democracy of places, which is not democracy in the directly political sense, but perhaps more in the historical sense. So when democracy takes place, it is democracy in the form of an event. This is the sense of democracy in the work of Jacques Rancière, for example. For Rancière, as for me, democracy is the activation of the principle of equality. When the principle of equality is really active, you have some version of our understanding of democracy. That is, democracy as the irruption of collective equality in a concrete form, which can be protest or insurrection, or popular assembly, or any other form in which equality is effectively active. So, this understanding itself has many forms, but we can perfectly understand exactly what this form of democracy is, and it is in fact a recurrent form of revolutionary democracy. But as you know, it is actually rather the form of a sudden emergence in history, and ultimately of the event, than the form of the consequences of an event, or of the creation of a new political body. As such, even if the moment of revolutionary rupture is a true meaning of democracy, it is not exactly the political concept of that meaning. I think it is a much more historical concept of democracy, that is to say, a concept that stands in relation to the event. And so we have to find a third sense of democracy, one which is properly the democracy of the determination of the new political subject as such. This is my ultimate conception. Democracy for me is another name for the elaboration of the consequences of collective action, and for determining the new political subject. So in the end, we have four terms: classical representative democracy, which is a form of state power; mass democracy, which is of a historical nature; democracy as a political subject; and finally, the process of the progressive vanishing of the state, which is the historical and negative inscription of politics in history, under the name of communism. So, for the clear classical opposition between the dominant false democracy and true popular democracy, we thus substitute a sort of complex with three places: state, revolutionary event, and politics, and three processes: affirmation of people's access to politics outside the state, negation of this access by the state, and victory for the political organization of people. And as a totalization of the entire complex, the advent of communism by concrete results, or results which are proofs of the weakness of the state, and finally of the possibility of its vanishing. Another example is precisely the relationship between politics and power. Classically, the goal of political action is to seize power, to destroy the state machinery of the enemies. The name for this process is the master name of all political classicism: revolution. Today, at the beginning of constitution, at the beginning of a new subjective body, it is not possible to be inside the state, or more generally, to aim for power. The word revolution can no longer be our master name. So we have to stand entirely outside state power. But the state is always in the field of political questions, and in the space of action. If our political subjectivity is not inside the state, if, on the contrary, it is on the outside, nonetheless the state is in the field of our action. To take a concrete example from my own experience, if we must do something about workers who are without papers, say African immigrants, and we want to organize and change things in this field, then we will quickly find that the state is in our space. We will have to confront new laws and state decisions. And we will have to create something that will come face to face with the state. Not inside the state, but face to face with it. So we will have to have a discussion with the state, or otherwise organize various forms of disruption. In any case, we will have to prescribe something concerning the state from outside. We will have to prescribe something that establishes a relation with the state. And the major difficulty will be to maintain the possibility of being outside while prescribing something that concerns the inside. In the development of politics, then, there is a sort of topological difficulty, namely, the relation between the outside and the inside. Because the state is always inviting you inside and asking you not to be outside. I have had many very concrete experiences of this. A good example is when I go with workers to discuss matters with some minister or other, because the state refuses their regularization. And the state representative will always ask, "Who are you?" And we always answer, "We are a political organization with people." And the reply is always, okay, but who are you? The problem is simple. To be somebody is to be inside the state. Otherwise, you cannot be heard at all. So there are two possible outcomes. Either there is ultimately a discussion and some political outcome, or else there is no room for discussion because we are nobody. Once more, this is the precise question of affirmation. How can we be somebody without being on the inside? We must affirm our existence, our principles, our action, always from outside. I know that some critics of my thought, who also aim to represent possibilities for a complete transformation of our situation, object that I am too far outside this process, that I am ultimately a prophet, and not really an active player in the immanent and concrete world. I completely disagree with this sort of objection because in its theoretical analysis of global society, it forgets the real logic of prescription and the necessity of having a new conception of affirmative dialectics. Without the French Revolution, without the great revolt of workers in France, without the real and concrete movement of the Parisian proletariat, Marx certainly would never have fathomed this concept of the proletariat. The movement is not from the concept of proletariat to the proletarian movement. The real becoming is from the revolt of workers to the new proposition. So, in the end, the true discussion is not at all about the concrete analysis of global society, but about our relation to the state. The real question is whether to be outside or inside the state. The fundamental idea is that to be in the new affirmative dialectical framework, you must be outside the state, because inside the state you remain precisely in the negative figure of opposition. And thus, once more, negativity, the appearance of negativity, comes first. I want to insist on the fact that the new logical framework is not only a vision of politics, or even a vision of some particular practices. It describes, much more generally, a sort of anthropology. First, I think we are animals. I speak of human animals and living bodies, and in contrast to all classical humanism, I include a lot of things in our definition of animals. Ultimately, this definition encompasses all our concrete existence as such, not including anything else or any supplement. And I indeed think that capitalist anthropology is the conviction that, fundamentally, humanity comprises nothing else but self-interested animals. That is a very important point. I think we have to engage in some propaganda on this point. Modern capitalism is always speaking about human rights, democracy, freedom, and so on. But we can in fact see very concretely that under all these names there is nothing else but human animals with interests, who have to be happy with products, and its subject is something like animals standing before the market. And this is, in actual fact, its definition of the human. We have a hierarchy, at the bottom of which are the poor, who stand facing the market but without means, and at the top of which are the rich, who also stand facing the market but who have far greater means. And the protection of all this is really nothing else but capitalist anthropology. Now, the possibility of being something other than animals in this sense is actually the becoming subject of a human animal. And it is through the incorporation of a new body, which is something other than standing before the market, that you can become something like a subject. Infinite is another name for this process, because what we have with this kind of incorporation is an affirmation of a new possibility with infinite consequences. The new possibility has infinite consequences. This is always the case. So we can say that human rights, rights that are the subject's rights, are in fact the rights of the infinite. It was Jean-François Lyotard who first coined this expression in his most important book, The Différent, and it is one I take up. But what ultimately is the anthropological question? I propose that this question runs as follows. What exactly is the singularity of mankind, of human beings? We know that today there exists a species of human animals, defined by their inclusion in the global market. And, by contrast, we can call humanity the capacity to become the subject of an event, of something that happens. The capacity to accept the possibility of incorporation within a new subjective body, the capacity of drawing its practical consequences in the situation of incorporation, which itself is the becoming of the new subject. And in the becoming of the subject, beyond the support of all that which is one or some human animals, there is something infinite, a new creation of something infinite. And for me, the name of this infinite something is truth. We can say then that the incorporation of the subject is the incorporation of some human animals in something like a process of truth. And that is the global field of what we can name humanity or human beings in the context of affirmative dialectics. I agree ultimately with the young Marx on one point. Only in the successive creation of new forms of subjects is there something like a generic humanity. Because generic humanity is infinite humanity. It is the same thing. And the human animal standing before the market is not at all generic. It is absolutely particular. All this comes to a new hypothesis about the subject, and it is also a new hypothesis about human life, about what it means for humans to live. In my book, Logics of the Worlds, I oppose human rights in their ordinary meaning to the rights of the infinite, by making a contrast between today's democratic materialism and the project of dialectical materialism, which is a possible name for affirmative dialectics. What makes these forms of materialism antithetical are their respective understandings of human life. Either there is nothing but languages and bodies, or else there is a third term, something like the production of truths that cut through the hegemony of our animal existence. The title of the conclusion of Logics of the Worlds is, What is it to live? It is clearly the end question of anthropology. In fact, there are two completely different conceptions of human life. The first reduces human life to common animal life, the satisfaction of all natural desires, happiness, security, and so on. The second one is what we are speaking of. Human life has to be identified with the incorporation to a truth body. So a human being is properly living only when he or she is the agent of a passage from particularity to universality, from a local process to genericity, from a singular world to an eternal truth. All these passages operate under a new idea, which is, for a concrete individual, the mediation between his or her practical singularity and the common or generic relationship to universality. For example, in politics, the name for this idea, which is the mediation between the concrete situation of political action and a form of eternal truth, is communism. Maybe this conception is a bit heroic. Indeed, we know that many philosophers affirm that the time for heroism has passed. But perhaps Althusser was right to affirm that philosophy has no history. The fact that an idea is old-fashioned is not, for the philosopher, an objection to this idea. In any case, even if the conception is a bit heroic, I affirm before you, it's mine. And I, certainly, am too old to change on this point.